Today's guest is somebody I've known of his work for many, many years, and he's always intrigued me. He's one of these writers that you think he just sounds so interesting, and I've heard from so many different sources about his writings and everything else. And we recently got in contact, and it's the great Mitch Horowitz, and Mitch sent me a copy of his latest book, Daydream Believer. And when I started reading the book, I thought, Daydream Believer, it must be something to do with the monkeys in some way or other. And as I read the book, I came across the most alarming, curious synchronicity that links Mitch and I, in that we've both met the Monkees drummer, Mickey Dolenz, under strange circumstances. And for me, what happened, it was probably about 1980, 81, 82, and I was at West Kensington Tube Station. And I came out of West Kensington Tube Station, and I bumped into him. I bumped into this guy. And you know the way you bump into somebody and you vaguely recognize them and you think that they're a friend of yours. So you kind of acknowledge them in some kind of vague way. And he looked at me quite strangely and acknowledged me and everything. And then I walked past him. And then as I walked out, I stopped and I went, that was Mickey Dolenz of the Monkees. Now I'm reading Mitch's book, and Mitch had a similar scenario. So before we start telling us a little bit about Mitch, your background and everything, can you just tell us a little bit about your link to Mickey Dolenz as well?
Right. It's more a synchronous link than anything else, but I find that these kinds of odd links, I guess we'll call them monkey winks, they incur quite a bit around the Monkees. Several years ago, I took a sabbatical from my work in publishing, and I had finished one project and I hadn't yet begun another. And just around that time, I had developed this weird, deep-seated interest in the Monkees. It was not long ago, maybe it was about 5-6 years ago, and I started listening to their music and reading biographies of the band and so forth, and nobody around me could understand where this sudden interest came from. Like many kids, of course, I had watched reruns of the show, and I had a warm feeling for the Monkees, but I had never had any pronounced interest until that moment. So I'm sitting on my sofa and I get an email that says that the book review editor of the Washington Post has been trying to reach me and I haven't been responding to his emails, which isn't like me. And I said, well, I haven't gotten any emails. And then we ironed out the communication snafu, and he said that Mike Nesmith, one of the members of the Monkees, a very innovative man, innovative artist, had just written a biography. And did they know that Nesmith was a Christian Scientist? I said, no. And did I know the man? And I said, no. Would I like to review it? I said, of course. And the book was called Infinite Tuesday. And in that book, among other things, Nesmith explained his conception of reality as being this infinitude of different dimensions with everything going on all at once, territory that you've certainly explored in some of your work that I've explored in mine. I think that's something that's very particular to this generational moment. We're all deeply interested in this question. And it was almost as if the very thing that Nesmith was writing about in his memoir was playing out in terms of my relationship to the band, which is to say, months earlier, with no antecedent, no glimmer of realization whatsoever that I would be asked to do this assignment, I had started cultivating this interest in the Monkees, which facilitated my writing the review in about 24 hours after I had finished the book. And people can go read about it themselves. I included in the review my references to the fact that this book, this experience seemed to almost be a portrait of the very thing he was writing about in the book. And then, not long thereafter, like you, I'm wandering around in a transportation hub. I was in an airport in Kansas City, Missouri, and there was Mickey Dolenz, and I just walked up to him and said hello. I didn't want to disturb him, and again, as you just described, he sort of stared searchingly into my face as if to ask, do I know you? And it was, so our stories run parallel, and I find that a number of people within the spiritual culture have these weird synchronous stories with the Monkees. So there you have it, a monkey wink.
A monkey wink. I really like that. I've always been fascinated by Michael Nesmith as well, because I mean, his solo albums, were very kind of country rock, which was very interesting in itself. But I never realized he was a Christian Scientist. I did know that his mother invented Tipp-Ex, and I was aware of that.
Yes.
Richard
And in
Gell's
the U.S., we call that liquid paper. That's our brand name for it here in the U.S. But,
and again, I wonder if we could draw a parallel here in some way between whiting things out in some way or other and Mary Baker Eddy and Christian Science. Because funnily enough, I visited the First Church of Christian Science in Boston many years ago, around about 35 years ago. I worked in the States for about 2 or 3 months in Boston, well, north of Boston. And I was always interested in Christian Science because,
yes,
you know, many of the elements of it are very much the kind of things we're interested in. And funnily enough, a previous guest on this show and a very good friend of Sarah and I is an internationally famous DJ called Kaz Coronel. And Kaz is from a Christian Science background. And again, you know, it's this very interesting idea, isn't it? You know, what is reality? What is it a perceptual thing? You know, are we our bodies? Are we spirit? And it's something that both you and I are very interested in. I know it very much interests Sarah. But to just roll back now a little bit. So who is Mitch Horowitz and what got you into this extraordinary writing that you do and this extraordinary reputation you have? How did it all start?
I really see myself strictly as a seeker, and I had the good fortune in adulthood to rediscover some of the metaphysical and occult topics that animated my interest when I was a kid. I worked many years for a New Age publishing company, and I began to realize at a certain point in that tenure that the history of some of the figures that I loved and was deeply interested in, including, for that matter, Mary Baker Eddy herself, the founder of the Christian Science Church, were often getting written about in the mainstream in ways that were disassociated from the values and efforts and humanity that some of these people possessed. And so I decided, I kind of came to feel, as I still do very strongly, that if you don't write your own history, it winds up getting written for you very frequently by people who do not connect with the values and ideas that emanate from your work. And so that led over a period of time to the writing of my first book, Occult America, which came out in 2009. And I never stopped since. So I had the good fortune of, as I said, rediscovering certain metaphysical topics in adulthood that I was very turned on by as a child, and frankly rediscovering myself as a writer in the process. I had been a journalist when I got out of school. I wasn't satisfied with it. I went into publishing. I wasn't satisfied with that. Publishing was very good to me on many levels, and there were many things I did in publishing that I'm proud of. But I did feel this unspoken gap within and this sense of depression that I wasn't really doing the thing itself. And of course, friends, as friends always do, said, no, you know, don't think that way. You're doing all kinds of wonderful things. And I knew they were right, but I also knew that they were, nothing could erase this feeling that I had that I wasn't fully participating in the work that I wanted to do. And there was a certain point at which I began to write about figures within the metaphysical culture again, and I hit upon what I really wanted to be doing, which was to write about metaphysics in history and practice. And so I never looked back, and that's what I do with most of my waking hours today.
So when you say that it's something that you were interested in when you were younger became an interest to you when you were older, so when you were younger, what were the areas? Because there seems to be an uncanny number of synchronistic parallels between you and I in terms of these interests, which we'll touch on later. But what were the areas that initially, as a youngster, were the ones that really caught your attention?
Well, I grew up in the borough of Queens in New York City, and at that time, it was the mid-1970s, and the occult was in the air. There had been a second wave occult revival in the late 1960s, and so you'd come home from school and reruns of The Twilight Zone or Dark Shadows would be on television, and you'd see popular U.S. talk show hosts like Mike Douglas or Merv Griffin interviewing robed gurus or astrologers. I was fascinated by all this, and my sister would bring home from school paperbacks on Bigfoot or flying saucers or ESP research, a very deep area of interest to me. The paperbacks of Carlos Castaneda, which were a source of influence when I was very young. And it just seemed like the mysterious and the supernatural was everywhere. And I really wanted to know what were the roots to these things. Of course, you could open up the newspaper and look at the astrology column, the horoscope column, Most of that today is migrated online. But I asked myself, look, whatever one makes of this stuff, where did these symbols come from? Why is it that every man and woman walking around in the modern Western world today knows his or her sun sign and could tell you something about it? And whether they profess belief or disbelief or indifference or what have you, they do know that material. And it's quite strange that astrology, which of course had its ancient beginnings in Mesopotamia and then worked its way up through the Hellenic world and has undergone many different permutations and novelizations, and it looks different today, of course, from what was known by some of our ancient ancestors. But regardless, why should any of this material have migrated across millennia? It's one of the oldest non-sectarian spiritual practices in the world, and it's enduring. I wanted to know where it came from. So even at a very young age, I was both enchanted with the material itself and with the backstory of the material, and that pretty well defines me today as well.
That's interesting, that, because one of the things that when I first started out, it was the same thing. It was very much the writings of, and I'm older than you, so it would have been the sort of mid 1960s. But, you know, it was the writings of people like John Keel, in terms of UFOs and things. And there was a very interesting English writer called Brinsley Le Portranche, who was in the House of Lords. He was called Lord Clancarty, and he was this very eccentric Irish aristocrat. And he was the first person to really come along the idea of ancient astronauts, way before Daniken. Daniken, you know, was 1968, 1969. But Le Portranche wrote the Sky People, I think about 1963, 1964. So that interested me, but I was also fascinated by astrology and why it was that astrology, as you rightly say, why it is something that came from ancient Mesopotamia and has continued, when self-evidently whatever it symbolized, symbolic of something deeper. It's like the I Chang, and it's like various other things. You know, there's something deeper in it, and we see the surface level. And I remember thinking as a kid that could it be something to do with the fact of the embryo in the womb? You know, the idea that we're all, our gestation within the womb is dependent upon our mother's moods and her chemicals in her body. Now, if your mother is carrying you through the high summer, there's going to be a very different chemical balance going on that you're being fed, rather than if it's in winter. So could it be that the reason that people observed these particular types and styles of behaviors in people, there was a validity to it? And of course, being the kind of civilization that looked to the stars and looked for shapes in stars and meaning in the stars, they then linked these personality traits to individuals because they saw them. Because I know, you know, from people I know, there's definite personality traits that you see run within star signs. Now, I'm a qualified psychometrician, and one of the things over the years I've earned my living in going into companies and doing psychometric profiles of people. And in many ways, there are similarities there. You know, they're still interpreting in exactly the same way the information. So we both had that kind of interest. And I know that you very much then moved into some very interesting areas of esoterical thought. And I'm very much intrigued in your concept of a mystical and esoteric America and the history of America from the founding fathers onwards. Would you tell us a little bit about that? Because I'm sure a lot of our American listeners would be really fascinated by this.
Sure. You know, the America is such a mass of contradictions. It always has been, and it is today. During the colonial period, of course, we saw the ongoing machinery of slavery in all its brutality, the destruction of the Native American culture. And yet there was in these colonies an untoward, unusual degree of religious freedom. It was not utopia by any means. There are plenty of people who couldn't vote, but to a great degree, there was no organized harassment of people who were heterodox religious believers. And this word went out across the Atlantic, and it attracted clusters of people. So you had, for example, even by the late 1600s, in the summer of 1694, there were a cluster of seekers of mystical pietistic monks who migrated from Central Europe to the city of Philadelphia, known as the City of Brotherly Love, founded by a Quaker. And this cluster of monks started a hermitage or a little commune on the banks of the Wissahickon Creek. And again, more groups began to come over, and another commune starts to show up in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. And as time passes, the inceptive members of the Shaker movement come over from England, from Manchester, and they establish a commune in 1775, 1776, up in the Hudson Valley outside the city of Albany in New York State. And all of this keeps going on, and these little communes and groups begin to grow, and the colonies really develop a reputation as a safe harbor for people with heterodox religious beliefs. And this includes Freemasonry as well. An outsized number of the founders were Freemasons. This includes George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, Paul Revere. And it's a very interesting situation in America because it's a very rural, sparsely populated society, very agricultural, almost no hospitals, no medical apparatus, no teaching universities. I mean, you had pockets of schools in Philadelphia and Boston and New York City, but the place was just sparsely populated and deeply agrarian. And so when you affix yourself, when you swear fealty to a group like Freemasonry, that's a foundational part of your life. That becomes a foundational part of your life. And the esoteric practices, the rites, rituals, traditions within Freemasonry, which included a radical ecumenism, which included a deep attachment, not just sentimental, but I would say something deeper and fuller than that, to the esoteric symbols of antiquity from Persia, Egypt, Greece, Rome. I think in many ways Masonry was probably the most radical expression of the Reformation. It was a capsule of preservation of some of the occult experimentation that went on during the Renaissance that later got squelched in reactions against that experimentation, including the 30 Years' War, which just devastated Central Europe during the 1600s. And yet, in this agrarian society where you had these pockets and clusters of religiously heterodox figures, where you had a figure who could found Philadelphia as the so-called city of brotherly love after experiencing discrimination as a Quaker at Oxford. I'm speaking of William Penn, whose family founded Pennsylvania. You had an environment where religious ideas could have a seismic effect. And this seismic effect was felt throughout the nation in a culture of religious experimentation, and a culture that became a kind of springboard for the exporting of alternative religious beliefs and for new religious movements such as Mormonism and Seventh-day Adventism and Christian Science, and occultic religious movements such as spiritualism or talking to the dead, which really began in its modern form in American log cabins and then expanded to the salons of Paris and London. So America, for all its contradictions, was a great laboratory of religious experiment. I think to some degree that remains the case. And so that became the basis for Occult America.
Yeah, it intrigues me, that, and that I'm by training a historian. Well, part of my training was history. And I've always been intrigued by schismatic religious movements. And I'm interested, you pointing out about the trauma of the 30 Years' War, the way in which, you had the weird movements, you had the Anabaptists coming up, and a lot of these ended up in New England and that kind of area. And immediately, and I never really made the link before to think, well, of course, this is Hydesville with the Fox sisters, but we also had, Mormonism. And the way in which Mormonism developed in upstate New York, and the way in which, they were looking for magical symbolism everywhere. And, the idea of, the linkage with, was Smith a Mason himself when, he...
I think you could describe Smith as a Philo-Mason. He wasn't a Freemason himself, but he was fascinated with Freemasonry because he saw the Freemasons engaged in the same thing that he wanted to do, which was to revive the rites and rituals of the ancient mystery traditions from Hebraic to Hellenic. So he borrowed from Freemasonry, and there was a heroism to these people. It depends on the historian. Some historians will look back and say, oh my God, this was just some crazy quilt of ideas that these, rural yokels were putting together. This was sort of this calico monstrosity of different spiritual ideas. I see it differently. I think that there was a heroic effort on the part of these people to use fragments that existed from antiquity, and they were making an effort in their way to revive what they believed were antique rites. They had greater and lesser successes, and this was true, of course, in the later occult movements, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and other movements, kind of cryptic or renegade Masonic movements, that they were desperately eager to reconnect with an antiquity that had come down to us in only fragments. And that's really our situation today as well. You know, we have precious pieces of what the ancients were doing, astrology being one of them, and it's undergone vast permutations. And yet, interestingly enough, in our era, new astrological texts of a Hellenic nature that have never been discovered are being translated, new Hermetic texts or fragments of Hermetic texts are being discovered. So I feel like there's a kind of I'm really hesitant to speak in terms of new cycles occurring, because it's really hard to get perspective on that until after the fact. We call things revolutions, or by names, you know, by which they become known worldwide, usually after the fact. So it's hard from being in the midst of it. But I do feel that there's something afoot today with some of the new texts that are being uncovered and discovered. And some related things, you know, this mainstreaming of the UFO thesis, which is not directly related to what we're talking about, but it's another of these things that sort of pokes holes in the straight story and makes us reconsider things, the way that some of the people we're describing were reconsidering antiquity and wondering, is there a way we can connect to this? And I feel like some of that is occurring today as well. And I say that conservatively. I mean, I don't like to speak in terms of new revivals or paradigm shifts or what have you, because again, we don't have the perspective, but there is something special going on today, I feel.
I think that's a very wise statement, you know, that effectively when you're within history, as we all are, inevitably, you never see the outcomes of scenarios. You always are within them, so you don't see how things are going to pan out in any shape or form. No. So when you know, there was this increase in revivalism in the 1830s, the burnt over place, you know, in York, you know, where revivalism was starting up. And it's extraordinary for me to note that while all this religious fervor was going on, we had this parallel movement where we had spiritualism starting up, as we said, with the Fox sisters and everything else as well. Yeah. And they were kind of toothing jowl with each other and reflecting each other. And then you had the new religious movements that seemed to, as you quite rightly say, incorporated a lot of the mysticism. I mean, I was in Utah a few years ago, and I took the opportunity to spend a time at the temple, the Mormon temple there, you know, and I was asking the questions they don't normally expect people to ask. You know, what were the esoteric background?
Yes.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because all they were trying to do was to try and Americanize the biblical legend, and to say, you know, that the lost tribes of Israel ended up moving across into America. Right. And, you know, it's extraordinary, isn't it?
And it seems at once so audacious and presumptuous to the point of absurdity, but then on the other hand, it's very natural, and it there's a certain sense to it when you look at the religious migration to America, including, for that matter, the ideas of the occult healer Franz Anton Mesmer. Mesmer was active in Paris in the years immediately preceding the French Revolution. He ran afoul of King Louis XVI, partly because there were, and it's hard for us to understand this today in the 21st century, but there was an unspoken politics to mesmerism, in the sense that if any individual from any walk of life could be placed into a mesmeric trance, or what we today might call a hypnotic trance, then it bespoke the basic equality of the human situation. Then all these outer titles and ranks of birth were rather meaningless. You know, we were essentially the same kernel of being. And so Mesmer gets run out of Paris, and eventually the revolution comes, and then the Reign of Terror comes. And during that period of time, you were just simply not going to be a practicing mesmerist in Paris. People were focused on staying alive, and some of this thought system migrated to other nations, including the United States. And Americans seized upon mesmerism with great zeal and began, as Americans often do, to seek ways to apply it that had gone beyond even things that the master himself had thought of or considered viable. So suddenly you have people in salons in Rhode Island and New Hampshire and New Jersey and New York State going into these so-called mesmeric trances, and they start reporting out-of-body experiences, and they start reporting astral travel, and this itself gives birth to a metaphysical literature. So all of this is contemporaneous to Joseph Smith's era, and he's saying to himself, well, you know, this is all quite remarkable. He participates in some of it himself. His family was steeped in certain occult lore and practices. Smith himself used to wear an amulet of Jupiter around his neck that probably came out of the work of Cornelius Agrippa, the great Renaissance era occult documenter, by way of a man named Francis Barrett, who was a kind of an adapter of latter-day adapter of Agrippa. Anyway, a lot of Americans had the attitude that the United States was kind of a new Israel that was establishing a new covenant with God, and you had all these new religious movements coming over. So whatever experience it was that Joseph Smith went through, what he was doing and the testament that he was bringing was not entirely outside of the context of the times. It was a very exciting time. And we don't necessarily look back on the 1830s, 1840s and think, wow, those were the good old days. But it was a very exciting time religiously.
I think your point there about, and I'd never really thought about this before, that mesmerism was something that suddenly there was a realization. You know, in France, you know, you had the three estates, and you had the nobility, and you had the clergy, and the third estate. But if everybody could be, as you rightly say, could be hypnotized into altered states of consciousness, that actually means that we're all the same. And I've never really analysed that in that way. I've always been fascinated, particularly French historians. I mean, there was the group called the Anel in the 1930s in France, people like Marc Bloch and Ferdinand Braudel, and they wrote some fascinating books about how, when we look in history, we always have to get into the minds of the people themselves. You know, yes. and I know Braudel argued, and I think it was in his book, The Mediterranean, where he said, you've got to get into the mind. No, feudal society. It was feudal society, Marc Bloch. And he said, imagine what it's like to be a peasant in the 16th century. The world, you know, darkness is darkness, you know, and when the sun goes down and there's wild animals out there, your worldview is very different. But you then translocate those people up into upstate New York, which was the wilds in those days. And they're in this really weird, dangerous place where you have, you know, the indigenous Americans upset that they're losing their land. You have this kind of religious freedom that you want to explore things and the mysteries that you want to discover. And you're going to get interested in them. You're going to get fascinated by these things. But then we have the other strain, don't we? Of, you know, in Massachusetts, where we have the Alcotts and we have the Transcendentalists, and that group of individuals who were looking at, from a kind of intellectualized way, about the human condition. So you have these parallel, and it must have been profoundly exciting, you know.
I can only imagine, and the feeling of discovery must have been just electric. You know, one of the remarkable things, it's funny, when people look at religious experimentation here in the United States, there's a tendency, and it's natural, we want to attach it to ancient movements. Well, they were borrowing from this, they were drawing on that. And there's some of that, of course. There's no question that there's some of that, you know, apropos of Joseph Smith and Masonry. Masonry, I don't know that we would call it an ancient movement, but it was retentive of or re-establishing of certain ancient ideas, at least as best as one could do. And yet, a lot of these people were just experimenting entirely on their own. We were talking about Mary Baker Eddy, for example. Sure, she had contact with Phineas Quimby, who himself had been interested in mesmerism, and she studied with him for a while, and she branched off on her own. But for the most part, you know, these people came from households that maybe just had a very, very small handful of books in them. They might have had the King James Bible, they might have had a couple of books of manners and morals, or, you know, Pilgrim's Progress or something of that nature. But the Bhagavad Gita, for example, when Emerson published his first series of essays in 1841, literally, there were probably just about 4 or 5 English translations of the Bhagavad Gita in the United States as a whole. One was in the library at Harvard, one was in Emerson's private collection, which he would loan out to Thoreau, and then the other 2 or 3, best as we can tell, were in private hands. There just wasn't access to this material, and Hermeticism likewise. Emerson and some of his circle wrote about Hermeticism, but there was really only one English translation extant at that time, and it wasn't until generations later that there were English translations available of greater or lesser value. So the people experimenting with New Thought, the people experimenting with Christian Science, Smith himself, they were really out there on their own. They were really out there on their own. And the fact that now and then they came up with parallel insights to antiquity was all the more exciting in that sense.
Because one of the people that has long fascinated me, that I know you've written extensively about, is Manly Hall.
Yeah,
and his work. Now, I've got 2 or 3 of his books, including that huge tome with the Great City of the Ages or whatever it was.
Right.
But I don't know much about him as a person. I don't know, where he came from or what stimulated him. So I'm intriguing. It's just because I've got the master here. I'm just wanting to get as much information out as you can.
Manly Hall was born in Canada, in the province of Ontario, in 1901, but he was really a man of the 19th century. His parents divorced just as he was born. He was raised by his maternal grandmother, and he traveled around Canada and the American West with his grandmother. He seems to have spent most of his life, his adolescent life, his young life, not going to school, not being educated in any formal way. He and his grandmother lived in North and South Dakota. They lived in other parts of the American West. They lived in the Midwest. They lived in Chicago for a short time. When he was about 15 years old, his grandmother brought him here to New York City, where I'm speaking from, and enrolled him in a military academy for a year, which must have been a painful experience for somebody who had never been subjected to formal schooling before, and that might have been the one and only formal classroom experience of the man's life, and he dropped out of that after about a year. His grandmother died when he was quite young. He was probably about 16 years old, and he went to work as a clerk within the finance business here in New York City to support himself. When he was 18 years old, he headed out west to California to reconnect with his mother. But it was a childhood and it was a past that you almost couldn't have today. Today, you'd have to enroll a kid in school. There'd have to be some knowledge of his whereabouts. But he really seemed to have no formal schooling whatsoever. He was sent out into the work world at age 16. Today in the United States, people can't figure out how to get their kids to leave their basement at age 30, and here's this young man who's financially and physically on his own at age 16. And it is hard to understand, as I've written about, where the learning came from that allowed him to complete a book like Secret Teachings of All Ages as he did. And it's all the more mysterious because it's funny when you observe the lives of people who peak very young. He wrote the Secret Teachings of All Ages at the age of 27. And again, no formal education. I would bet probably no more than a year's worth of classroom experience at the military academy he attended. He traveled. He went to some of the new museums, the British Museum, the New York Public Library, that were open to the public at that time. And his active assemblage at so young an age, it was not ordinary, and it is difficult to understand.
I find that absolutely extraordinary, that his lack of formal education, because that book is extraordinary.
Yeah,
he must have been an absolute sponge for information, because there's everything in there, isn't there? And it's a massive book.
If that book were presented and someone said, the author of this book spent his or her lifetime on this book, died at the age of 90 after a lifetime of research, without any of the digital information sources that we possess today, one would say, well, that was a life well lived. That was a worthy life. But to be 27, and no education, and no university training, just a guy wandering around to different libraries like a vagabond, just incredible. Just incredible.
And that he managed to get a publishing deal as well. Did he self-publish, or did somebody spot the potential of the book?
He self-published. And by that time, he was living in Los Angeles. And I suppose there was a great advantage to him living in Los Angeles in that time because here it is, the 1920s. Los Angeles is on its way to becoming the movie capital of the world. There's oil money there, there's railroad money there, there's agriculture money there. But Los Angeles as a city is still, it's a rural place. You could probably walk your way to Orange 20s. Los Angeles is on its way to becoming the movie capital of the world. There's oil money there, there's railroad money there, there's agriculture money there. But Los Angeles as a city is still, it's a rural place. You could probably walk your way to orange groves from any part of Los Angeles at that particular time. And so you have people there who have money, but there's not a great deal of culture. And you don't have the opera houses and the libraries and the hospitals and the universities. And so they're looking for people to patronize. So they patronize a figure like Manly Hall. They patronize a figure like the short story writer Raymond Carver. They patronize the great spiritual teacher Jiddu Krishnamurti. They patronize some of the folks in the Theosophy movement. And so he benefited greatly, I think, from coming of age intellectually at a time when Los Angeles, formerly a ranching town, was coming of age economically and wanted a cultural apparatus to match its economic growth. And he was one of the people who attracted benefactors for that reason. So he was able to self-finance the book and many other things.
Where did he go? Where did he go from there? After he'd written this incredible work, what did he then do? Did he continue? How did his life pan out?
Well, he founded a campus in the Griffith Park neighborhood called the Philosophical Research Society, which opened in 1934 and is still there today. I was just out there speaking a few weeks ago. Beautiful, beautiful Art Deco campus, stunning place, constructed in a pastiche of Egyptian, Mayan, and Art Deco style, which was sort of the rage at that moment. I will say this, he had significant moments in his life thereafter. He founded a beautiful campus. He spoke every week at length without notes. He produced some compelling and intriguing books and publications. But in my estimation, he also struggled to find sort of a second act in his life. I referenced earlier, he peaked really young. And when you peak at age 27 or so, it's a mixed blessing. And he had produced such a magisterial work and gained such a reputation at so young an age. I think that by middle age, he was wondering what to do next. And I think that probably contributed to a tragic situation much later in his life, where shortly before his death, he was taken advantage of by a father-son team of con artists, and they got him to sign the power of attorney of his will over to them, and they caused just legal and financial chaos at his organization, which was financially reduced in its holdings thanks to their chicanery. And I think he must have been feeling a sense of disappointment. Maybe he was fearful that his name would not be remembered after his passing. But here we are discussing him, and he's being read today by more people than read him during his lifetime. So his fears, fortunately, were misplaced. But I do think it must have weighed on him psychologically to have peaked so young and then have to ask himself over the ensuing decades, what next?
Yeah, it must have been, extraordinary, and you think that, he achieved so much in that way. And there's somebody else, before we get into you, there's somebody else that I'm very, very keen to discuss with you, is Neville Goddard, because yes. I know you're quite fascinated by him. Now, he's somebody I'd never heard of before. And somebody, I picked it up, your references to Neville Goddard, and I know that you've worked a lot with him or written a lot about him. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Well, it's interesting. He, too, was sort of a figure of the 19th century, but who lived in the 20th. He was born in 1905 on the island of Barbados. He was a British Barbadian. And like Manly Hall, he was more or less on his own at a very young age. At age 17, he left Barbados and traveled to New York City to study theater. Again, not the pattern that one finds among many American kids nowadays. And he grew interested in theater. He had some success. He was in some silent movies. He was a dancer. He was a stage performer. And as he aged, by his more or less late 20s, he developed a deep and abiding interest in metaphysics. He was imbibing some of the new metaphysics that was sweeping through the Western world at the time, which we would call New Thought, this idea that the mind is causative, that the mind is a vehicle that outpictures all of your emotionalized thoughts. And Neville grew deeply enchanted with this idea. In his backstory, he says he teamed up with a black man of Jewish descent named Abdullah, with whom he studied Kabbalah and number symbolism in scripture. And through Abdullah's tutelage, Neville said he came to his own philosophy of a kind of, well, to put it simply, his philosophy was your imagination is God. Your imagination is symbolically represented in scripture as God. And scripture is neither a work of history nor a parable of man's struggle with the sacred, but is a blueprint of your own psychological development. And this will culminate in your realization that the Creator essentially went to sleep clothed within human flesh, and we are that being, and we need to reawaken ourselves, and that everything that you're experiencing, including my words right now, is a product of your own intellectual projections. So Neville would say, it would follow, there's no Mitch here, there's no Mitch here. And your listeners, whoever is listening, it's you. It's you. There's no Tony. There's no Mitch. There's no Sarah. This is your intellectual framing projected outward, and for whatever reason, you're just ready to receive these ideas right now. It's a kind of extreme idealism, and that was Neville Goddard.
That is very, very interesting in many ways, particularly the way in which modern quantum physics is telling us, and immediately when you mention this, I'm immediately remember, the Bill Hicks monologue of we're all one single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. I'm also then very much reminded of a lot of the work of Philip K. Dick and the idea of, his book, The Divine Invasion, where you have the little boy Manny, who's God, who's forgotten he's God. So you have an awful lot of themes, and I always find it fascinating here that an awful lot of these esoteric thinkers were working within an environment, an intellectual environment, that they would be more advanced than the people around them, but they didn't have the framework and the structure of the science, because,
Yes.
the revolution of 1900 of Max Planck, and everything else, and the quantum revolution, but they didn't have that. Or if they did, they weren't fully aware of it. It was going in parallel with them. Whereas nowadays we are in this wonderful opportunity whereby we can meld these things together and get a much bigger picture. We're getting the technicolor picture of exactly what is really going on. And this is what excited me so much about your new book, because something that I can vaguely understand the issues of why people talk about, sort of manifesting your destiny, manifesting the things that you want in your life. But of course, an awful lot is kind of new agey, wishy-washy, not thought through terribly well kind of stuff, the laws of attraction. Yep. Whereas your book really hits the nail on the head. You really take it and you shake it and you pull it around and you say, look at it from this angle. And then suddenly, for me, it made sense. And it was the first book, and I was quite excited. And I was thinking, because as Sarah knows, I'm very much a half-empty kind of guy. The glass is always half-empty. So things go wrong for me all the time. Like today, it's how it happens. And I keep thinking, am I manifesting my own, I'm anticipating things and they come to pass. Now, in your book, can you explain to everybody, and we'll draw Sarah in now because she's manifested herself into our world after a slight absence there. What the book is about and what stimulated you to write it, because it is extraordinary. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I appreciate that enormously. I came to feel that New Thought as a philosophy and what I've been describing from the work of Neville Goddard, I came to feel that it all has a raw, rough truth about human nature. And yet it gets lost in some of the language that you were referencing. Manifesting law of attraction is very unclear. And I went back to some of the some of the late 19th, early 20th century literature by the pioneers of New Thought, because I thought, well, gee, I want to go back to the source and see what were these people actually experiencing.
That's what surprised me about your book. I hadn't realized that it had been around for as long as it had. I find that quite extraordinary.
Yeah, you'll find kind of rough and ready iterations of New Thought, probably going back to the 1870s or so. You'll find it before that in the work of Phineas Quimby as well. And there too, I met with frustration because rather than using terms like manifestation or law of attraction, they would use terms like soul or spirit without defining what these things actually were. 19th century writers on both sides of the Atlantic were in love with using the term soul without ever pausing over whether humanity has a soul or what is that and so forth. And I began to feel that if I really believed in and was attached to these ideas, I needed to get my hands much more dirty in terms of trying to figure out what was going on. So I embarked as deeply as I possibly could in a study of quantum theory, string theory, psychical research. I'm very, very interested in academic ESP and psychical research. And I began to look into all these areas that suggest to us that the mind does have non-local or extraphysical capacities, that the psyche, which I see as a compact of thought and emotion, very possibly, I'm sort of extending my neck at this point, but I'm trying to encapsulate all of this, very possibly is able to move among different intersections of time. An idea that shouldn't sound as far out to us as it does at first blush, because the theories of Einstein themselves, which have since been proven, demonstrate that time is conditional. Someone moving at or near light speed experiences time differently. You experience time differently in an environment of extreme gravity, like a black hole. Even astronauts in our own time, while they're not moving anywhere near the velocity of light speed, they do experience minute reductions in the aging process, actually measurable minute reductions in the aging process. This is real. So the fact that someone would claim that linear time is perhaps not the final word on reality, whether they're speaking in terms of precognition or whether they're speaking in terms of the psyche's ability, perhaps, to move beyond intersections of time, that shouldn't sound as far out as it does. And we're getting suggestions of this in all kinds of fields and in interpretations of different fields. People will talk about string theory, which is just a conceptualization of reality. It's not reality itself. It's a model. It's compelling. It's devised to try to explain why surrealistic things go on in our world. Why particles and larger objects mirror one another at a distance, for example, when we can't find any causation. So what's the causation? So suddenly the interdimensional thesis begins to look more appealing. Well, maybe objects are on these strings and these things pass in and out of the dimensions that quantum theory suggests exists. So maybe all of this talk of positive thinking or manifestation, maybe it's acts of selection. I favor the word select versus manifest. Maybe we are able to move among these different intersections of time. Maybe we're doing it constantly, including at this instant, constantly reorienting ourselves to different senses of past, present, future, based on emotionally held conviction, based on emotionally charged thought, based on what we expect to be there. Maybe our senses are tools of measurement, not much different, although they're biological, of course, than tools of measurement in the quantum lab, where they're exquisitely well tuned and they're able to see more of what's really going on at the particle level. Maybe that's going on with us. So I felt I needed, if I'm going to declare fealty to this philosophy of mind causation, I needed to get really into the grid of things and ask, is this possible? How is this possible? And what might be a theory of what's going on? And that was the birth of the book.
Well, because I found it, because as you know, in my writings, I take a very similar viewpoint.
Yes.
And in my latest book, I'm particularly interested in the reciprocity of how our perceptions work with the external world, you know.
Yes.
And the point you're making, then that's why I was delighted reading your book, because you go down similar paths to myself, you know, the idea of non-locality, the idea of the EPR paradox, the idea that, and some of the work that's been done now by people like Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna,
yeah,
where we now know you entangle two subatomic particles, one reacts instantaneously. Now, how can that be possible if there's the limitation of light speed? Mm-hmm. So clearly, you know, there seems to be a deeper level of reality where everything seems to be a unity. And I'm reminded here very precisely about the work of people like David Bohm and various other individuals, and specifically, and I was very excited when I was reading your book, some of the latest work, the latest paper that Stephen Hawking wrote in his top-down hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in Hawking's work with Thomas Hertog, he argues that within the very first nanoseconds of the Big Bang, everything that potentially could be was already encoded within the universe. And all we do is we collapse the wave function of the intentions, and the universe accommodates our decisions and shrinks to that reality in anticipation of what we are doing. And suddenly there's this massive feedback mechanism, and it's far more interesting. Sarah, I know that probably as always, you're sitting there making vast amounts of notes and dying to get in. So
I am actually. This is an incredibly synchronistic topic, because I've just come back from a Mesopotamian-inspired astral bathing weekend. Mm-hmm. And I think what you were saying about horoscopes and this reinvigoration of interest in astrology is amazing. And I think that perhaps it's just a kind of an effect of information being so accessible now. We can find amazing information online, and slowly over a long period of time that's built up to inform people, and to, you know, astrology is becoming much more of a science, I suppose, and a reinvigoration of ancient style astrology as well. I actually just got this from Watkins' book the other day. I was doing my astrological chart today. So and then I thought it was very interesting as well. Your name's Horowitz, and that's etymologically kind of time sense, time wisdom. And I wonder whether, you know, I'm very much interested in the ancient conception of magic, and putting one's will through drawing or writing to make a magic spell. And it's almost as if your name is a magic spell to make you explore. And
Interesting. I appreciate
that. The secret of time is really the secret of how all of these anomalous phenomena can take place, because, as you say, our reality, the reality of our time and our perception of time, is sculpted by our position in time and space, and can only ever be a local perception. And there must be something much vaster beyond that, which the stars, the immortals, the imperishables, will be privy to.
You know, it's funny, I'm moved toward a certain declaration as we're talking, and I've never been entirely explicit about this, but here's the moment to be explicit. It seems to me that if you look back to what some of the pioneers of the New Thought movement were doing in the 1870s, one could say, well, you know, they were right about this, they were wrong about this, they leaned too heavily on words like soul, you know, as I was complaining about, but they did have extraordinary instincts for human nature. They foresaw fields that really wouldn't dawn for generations. Placebo studies, organized psychical research, all these interpretations of quantum theory that we've been talking about, and how they provide parallel insights to certain ancient spiritual ideas and so forth. And so one has to give the founders of New Thought a great deal of credit for having an instinct about things that wouldn't become common discussion until literally generations later. And one of the things I'm wondering is this. It seems to me that these popularizations of quantum physics began maybe about 30, 40, maybe in the early 70s. Okay, let's say Gary Zukav's book, Dancing Wu Li Masters, and other books contemporaneous to that, helped to create this first generation of popularization of quantum physics, and that field has produced some really, really fine literature by many people working within the clinical laboratory themselves, who were willing to interpret this data, something that was discouraged in earlier generations. So now that you have quantum physicists who are willing to interpret this data, now that you have people who are students of metaphysics who are part of this conversation, I guess one of the things I'm wondering is this. You know, it was common, say 20 years ago, I remember, that science columnists and critics and mainstream folk would say, oh, these New Agers, they are butchering quantum theory. They are cherry picking from quantum theory. They are taking things that are going on under extremely fixed conditions and ridiculously extrapolating them out, you know, into the everyday world. Well, perhaps the New Agers' instincts were correct, just as the pioneers of New Thought possessed instincts that were correct. Yes, there are dead ends. Yes, there are human foibles. Yes, there's foolishness. That's part of human nature. But maybe, their instincts turned out to be correct. Because frankly, I am hearing a lot less from the mainstream right now complaining about the manner in which New Agers have hijacked quantum physics. New Agers have hijacked quantum theory, because these discussions are occurring on such a level that articles are appearing in magazines like Scientific American, not exactly known as a fount of occult thought, that are reflecting the very subject matter that we're talking about right now. Articles about perception selecting reality, or reality being a thing that's actually dependent upon a sentient observer, whether in quantum theory or in other areas of interdimensional study where things are going on that are reacting to our ability to measure, to perceive, to record. And questions of idealism start to come in. Would this stuff be there at all in the absence of a sentient or mechanical observer? And so it could be that as everyone was writing their irritated columns in Scientific American and the New York Times 30 years ago, complaining about, how the New Agers were butchering the new metaphysics, maybe the New Agers brought a necessary idealism to the table and actually had a very good, rough instinct for where this field was going, because this is where we find ourselves, and these conversations are occurring in physics departments. They're not just occurring in New Age salons, and the interpretation of this material has become a really urgent part of our public discussion.
I think what's happened is, isn't it, there's been the change. There was the old diktat of don't try to understand what quantum physics means, just shut up and calculate, which was the term that was bandied around in the 1970s and 1980s. But we know from individuals like Richard Feynman and lots of other people going back even further, Erwin Schrödinger in the late 1930s in his book, What is Life? We know that people like Niels Bohr had a very, very philosophical attitude towards the implications of quantum mechanics and what he was telling us. And there was a very, very brave book that was written around about 15 years ago by a couple of professors from one of the American universities about quantum mechanics and consciousness. And it was Rosenblum and Kopner.
That's a very fine book, Quantum Enigma. That is a very fine book.
Wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the way in which they describe the mysteries of non-locality and the way in which they describe how entanglement takes place and the mysteries of entanglement is the best I've ever read. And I don't know if you recall, do you remember at the start of that book, they turn around and they say that when they said they were going to be writing this book, the associate professors they were working with were making a statement was almost reminiscent of your analogy about Mesmer and the equalization, when they were saying you shouldn't be teaching people this because it's giving them an unexploded bomb. But the point of the fact is it's been hidden for years. We know 1981, the Aspect d'Alibard-Roger experiment in Paris at the Institute of Optics proved the non-locality was experimentally real and proved, what John Bell had said in 1964. Now, these things are extraordinary, but it's as if there's this fear that if it's given to the masses are going to somehow misinterpret it.
Yes.
And they're going to misunderstand, and the New Age wackos are going to take over.
Right.
Now, my philosophy and my writing, all my books, I really make the point of doing the science. I go into the nth degree in terms of the science, because the science is fascinating. You don't need to be New Age in this way. As you say, Gary Zukov, brilliant book. Isaac Bentov.
Yes. Stalking the Wild Pendulum. That is one of the greats.
Yeah. What an extraordinary
one of the greats.
That is.
Yeah.
Isn't it? I think we've probably read the same books.
Right. Well, we're living the same life.
And Bentov, wasn't it amazing? His little diagrams that he had.
Humorous and yet mind-bending. Absolutely mind-bending. The man was a genius.
And then you move on and you get people like the guy that wrote the Holographic Universe. Right. And again, all these guys
incredible.
Were the precursors of the stuff we're now trying to do and trying to popularize it, but not dumb it down. Yes, we agree. Right. I mean, one of the things that annoyed me, for instance, was the level of criticism that came out with the movie What the Bleep.
I couldn't agree more, and I was referencing that really without naming it just when I was talking earlier about the science columns that would say these guys are butchering quantum theory. They're not. It was a much better movie than it was given credit for by the critics. I like that movie.
I know, and the way they showed the twin slit experiment.
Yeah.
You know, and the way that the cartoon character of Dr. Quantum, which he is it Lee Allen Wolfe?
God, is it Lee
Fred
Allen
Allen
Wolfe?
Fred
Allen Wolfe. Right. That's right.
I mean, what used to annoy me there was you watch that and they ridiculed it. And yet you will have somebody else come along who's an official scientist, but Fred Allen Wolfe is a scientist.
Yes,
and they will put it in one of the standard books that's acceptable. And they're all nodding dogs and going, yes, this is all mysterious and really fascinating. But
it was a fascinating depiction of quantum mechanics and interpretations. It would be great for kids to watch because it orients them, it orients adults. And I agree. I mean, I literally was thinking of that exact example as I was saying 30 years ago, you had all these naysayers, and very frequently they were reacting to that movie. But I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead. No,
I was going to say, but the thing was, I think the problem with What the Bleep was, I think its association with Ramtha, the Ramtha Institute, and that clearly, you know, was then into channeling and everything else as well, which is no, you don't. Well, and it's an interesting area, isn't it? You know, with my concept of the daemon. But nevertheless, these books. You know, and for instance, you know, sort of Jeff Forshaw and Brian Cox, two very doyens of British quantum physics.
Yes,
and Brian Cox is very popular on the British television. One of his books a few years ago was called "Everything That Can Happen Will Happen," which is exactly the same as what we've been saying in this discussion. That somewhere in the universe there will be, but this is going the ideas of Poincaré. This is nothing original at all. It's just looking at it in a different light and trying to apply it to the things we're interested in, extraordinary UFO experiences, psi, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences. Why can't we include them? Why is it said that we can't do it?
Well, you know, it's funny. I'm borrowing this from somebody on Twitter this morning, and I don't remember his name, so forgive me that I can't provide sufficient credit, but he said something to the effect of, the skeptics are running out of excuses. And that's lovely. And what that really means is that materialism is running out of excuses. The philosophy of materialism, which essentially holds that matter creates itself, and that there's absolutely non-locality. The world is explicable by Newtonian physics, except at the particle level, which we'll just kind of write off and assume can't be extrapolated, even though the nature of a law is that it's universal. Materialism is running out of excuses, and it's going to linger. It's going to linger. I don't think anytime soon the philosophy of materialism is going to cede control over major swaths of academia, media, and opinion-shaping organs. But it's on the ropes, and it's almost getting laughable. It's literally almost getting laughable, the point to which materialist skeptics are trying to explain away the UFO phenomenon, for example. You know, here the UFO phenomenon has gone mainstream. Every serious person agrees, well, there's a question there. We don't know what it is, but we can no longer talk about swamp gas and little green men and, you know, make fun of people and such. Is it extraterrestrial? Is it interdimensional? I'm very interested in this discussion because if you use the principle of Occam's razor, where the simplest idea that covers all the bases is probably the right one, I think the interdimensional argument is starting to win out. We have better models of interdimensionality at present than we do of extreme velocity or of these cosmic wormholes that maybe could allow beings to travel vast distances. Those models exist too. But I think the interdimensional models are better developed, so it may be that the field starts to go more and more in that direction. I don't know. None of us know. But we have a fantastic question in front of us, and you know, there's a handful of skeptics who are still insisting that, you know, it's somebody flying a kite, you know, made of aluminum foil or so, and it's almost reaching the point of silliness. And the great Enlightenment rationalist David Hume had a formula for applying to miracles, which is that the excuse in opposition to the miracle had to be eventually become more fantastical than the reported miracle itself. So what's more fantastical? That we're seeing something that we truly don't understand and we have to remain uncertain about it, something we human beings don't like doing, or that it's some kid flying a kite made of aluminum. You know, it's just, I think rationalism itself is starting to dictate that we have to, and we have, as I think as a culture, acknowledge the UFO question. So the naysayers are running out of excuses, and they have a few more, and they're not going to go away anytime soon. They have a commanding media presence, but I think we're seeing a changeover.
Well, I think the major problem I find is that they won't engage with us. They will engage. They love engaging with the real wackos, the real people.
That's right.
They
punch down.
They can really
so
have a go at.
Yeah.
And they love that.
Yeah.
But they avoid. I'll guarantee they avoid you, and they avoid me like the plague.
Oh.
You know, because they really don't want somebody to be able to come back at them and say, well, you know, there was this experiment in this year which suggested this. Are you ignoring that information? You know, and it's the idea that the fact that, you know, we have, as you rightly said, that we have two levels of reality abutting each other. We have the quantum world and we have the big world. You know, we have the cosmological world and we have the quantum world. And even the equations they apply don't apply with one to the other. They get infinities. So clearly, and they're finding, you know, how much bigger the subatomic particles have to be before they show duality. You know, we've got buckyballs, you know, 60 atoms.
Right.
And they, you know, they effectively come into existence and their wave function is collapsed at the act of observation or measurement. And of course, they then argue,
and they pass through solids.
What you mean by measurement? No, we're not. You know, no, we're not. There still is the sentient mind that's interpreting the information coming through the microscope.
Exactly right.
Or whatever.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
You know,
I have found repeatedly that the skeptics will slither out of debates. Rupert Sheldrake tries to debate them. I try to debate them. You try to debate them. They slither. They dodge. I mean, I make some comment on this in Daydream Believer because I dedicate a full chapter to psychical research, which I'm very interested in, and I really do wish that the opportunity...
I mean, your stuff on Daryl Bem and the way he was rubbish, you know, it was brilliant. It was excellent.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I'm about to publish an article on that, actually, because Bem's data is now 10 years old, and it's been replicated, and it's been meta-analyzed, and it's a good time to look back at it. And so I'm publishing an article very soon in defense of the Bem data. And the way that he was savaged, for anybody who doesn't know, Daryl Bem is a clinical psychologist at Cornell University who spent 10 years structuring clinical tests to study for precognition. And he came up with incredible results, which have been studied and meta-analyzed, encompassing of many different studies over dozens of dozens of studies over the course of a decade, giving lie to the oft-heard claim that psychical research data is not replicated. Bem is a case in point in our own era of replication. He abetted it, did great work, man of tremendous integrity, and he was eviscerated. He was savaged. And it's very hard to get a hearing for people like that. You know, very hard to get a hearing. I could name all the mainstream sources that savaged Daryl Bem, but boy, you go back to some of these places with an article in defense of him, no matter how soberly worded, no matter how gently broached, and no, it can't be because it can't be. It's a kind of materialist fundamentalism, and it's going already. The joints are weakening. The joints are weakening. We're not there yet, but this material is gaining a hearing in a way that I think it couldn't when What the Bleep came out. It's still tough going, and Bem really, I mean, the man must have a heart of a lion because he put up with terrible criticism, much of it very unfair.
I know, as you say, you know, a lot of the earlier work that was done, you know, that's been rubbished as well, you know, in terms of psi. And, you know, there are statistical methods and the statistical methods, you know, what us that have been trained, you know, I did stats at postgraduate level at the LSE. And, you know, I understand how the stats work, and the statistics work. You know,
yes, they work. They work.
Furious here.
Now, let me ask you guys a question. I want to put this question to you. I have been criticized by people who are very sympathetic to our discussion, people who care very deeply about metaphysics, for being overly attached to empiricism, for being overly attached to the laboratory model. My good friend Jeff Kripal, who's the Associate Dean of Humanities at Rice University.
Yeah, Jeff's
and I have
been
this
a guest
book.
of this program earlier.
Lovely man, wonderful man, and a friend and a source of inspiration. He has lovingly criticized me and said, look, it seems to me that the laboratory is the perfect place for the psi effect to disappear. That's why you're struggling over these, little statistical variances, whereas out in the world, testimony among individuals, which is valuable, some of which can be directly proven, and Jeff has many studies in which he's participated, where individual testimony can be empirically backed up. You got to be out in the world. You got to be out in the wild. You got to be among the public. You're going to find much more tantalizing examples of what you're looking for in the wild than you are in the zoo, so to speak. And there was another parapsychologist, I read about him in the book, lovely man who died a few years ago. He lived until age 100. Lawrence LeShan. Lawrence, shortly before his death, and he dedicated a lot of his life to laboratory study of parapsychology, he voiced something similar. He said to me, and I'm not sure he's right, mind you, I'm not sure he's right, but he said to me, look, I think we've gone as far as we can go empirically. We've got the empirical data. It's been replicated. We need a new paradigm in this science. I don't know what it is, but we need a new paradigm. And Jeff has said to me, you're too attached to the lab. It's among the individual where you can find the most fantastic examples. You're spending too much time thinking that if you can play by the rules of materialism, you can dethrone it.
But what they'll do is they'll attack you.
I want to know what you guys think of that.
What they will do, don't you? They'll attack you and they'll turn around and they'll say the classic phrase, the plural of anecdote is not proof. And it's what they use, isn't it? They'll say,
it's a soundbite. Yeah.
But it's labeling. I call this the labeling theory. The idea, you give it a label and you've explained it. Hallucinations. Well, it's an hallucination. Well, you've explained it then, haven't you? Of course you have. Nobody has an idea what hallucinations are. Sarah, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I guess as technology advances, there may become more sensitive equipment, more interesting scientific discoveries about how these things work. I do kind of find anecdotal evidence requires a bit of faith, because taking people entirely at their word when someone is subject to so many different factors, and just talking to people on a day-to-day basis, you realize that they perceive things incredibly differently. I remember talking to a friend at school who said that he saw a ghost move a cup on the sideboard, and when you get water underneath the cup, it naturally moves. And there are all kinds of people that think that means they've seen a ghost, but actually there's water on the sideboard, and that. So I don't find anecdotal evidence, or even reporting and writing down what you've experienced, to be especially reliable ever, because people are subject to vast discrepancies in how they perceive things.
And don't you find? And I've found that every time when I've been writing books and I've drilled deeper into the famous cases, they start to fall apart. And you find it very frustrating, because there's a case you will have genuinely believed, and then you ask another question, and there's a very famous out of body guy that I won't name, but I was in my book on the out of body experiences, I wrote a lot about his work, and he makes a number of claims in his books, and I literally asked him, and I said, you claim that you got the best ever results here, and that you went astral traveling with your son. Can I speak to your son about this? No, he doesn't talk about it anymore. Then it was the papers that you got these great results. Where are they? Oh, they were all destroyed in a flood. And you feel
the famous flood.
To evaporate.
Yeah.
Because people start to believe their own legends in these things. And as Marcello Truzzi said, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And if we are going to challenge in any way whatsoever, and I know these phenomena occur because I've seen them. I've seen recognition take place in front of my eyes. I know they happen. But just because there are so many characters out there that are in for making the cheap buck, the dollar, trying to make themselves millionaires by pretending that they can do things, or indeed they can do things, but they can't do them on demand.
Exactly.
Always the issue.
So
I'm totally with you on this, Mitch. And Sarah, you and I have discussed this many times, that we really need to get the evidence. We can't just keep saying that, Auntie Doris said that she got out of her body and saw something. It doesn't hold water.
Yeah. I was very influenced. My intellectual hero is J.B. Ryan, the founder of the Parapsychology Lab at Duke University, and I think I'll just forever be influenced by Ryan. He was a statistician, very conservative, almost frustratingly conservative to some of his collaborators. I think one of the mistakes that JB made in his career, and he was a great man and a wonderful man, but he resisted coming up with a theory for ESP, a theory of conveyance. He thought, look, my job is to assemble evidence. I will let, whether they're metaphysicians or whether they're interpreters of evidence, they can devise the models. I'm not devising a model, I'm providing evidence. I think that was a mistake. I think JB should have been. I've spoken with his daughter Sally about this, who's still living. Wonderful.
Funny enough, I was talking about Sally 2 weeks ago because Graham Nichols, who's a mutual friend of Sarah and I's, Graham spent because Graham is a really powerful out-of-body experiencer, and Graham is the real deal. He really is the real deal.
Yeah.
And but sorry, I jumped in there. But...
No, and I've spoken with Sally about this, and we've talked about it. I reproduced some correspondence in Daydream Believer. I wish that before his life had ended, JB would have been more public about some of his musings about a theory of conveyance. And there was a mathematician and a foundation executive named Warren Weaver, who was a sympathetic critic of JB's work, and they exchanged letters, and Weaver said to him, look, I do believe that you've assembled valid evidence, but your data is never going to get its day in court until you've come up with a theory. That's just the culture of science in the Western world. Maybe it's wrong, maybe we dwell too much on theories, but that's the shape of our judicial process within the scientific world. You have to have a theory, and then people test it. And so, anyway, in my own fitful way, I wanted to make an effort to provide a theory of mental selectivity or mental causation or what have you, because I suppose, again, I am attached to that model, for better or worse. I am attached to that model, and so I will keep working with it.
I find what you're saying so refreshing, because I'm exactly the same. In my books, I come up with hypotheses. I don't just say the out-of-body experience, because one of the things that's frustrated me over the years, how many near-death experience books, out-of-the-body experience books, they're just a series of anecdotes. They're just, gee whiz, it happened to me. Nobody is sitting back, with the exception maybe you and I, are going, okay, let's think about this. How does this fit in with quantum mechanics?
Yes.
How can we come up with a model that can be tested in some way under laboratory conditions to prove it, and take it to the skeptics and say, deal with that one, face ache.
Right, right.
Because that's the only way we're ever going to do it, because we can read these books out till the cows come home.
Right.
They're never going to be convinced.
Right,
but you give
right.
them the facts. They can't then wiggle off the hook anymore.
Right. They're running out of excuses, as we've said.
I think that's an amazing point, and actually I do think that returning to philosophy will save the world, and we need to have a marriage of this kind of research with philosophical thinking as well. And it's interesting because we have this culture, kind of algorithmic culture, where people are polarized. I do think it's actually generating perhaps like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's idea of the noosphere, and we're reaching kind of critical mass perhaps of the noosphere, and it's driving us more towards an oracular culture, because actually we can make predictions more accurately about just about everything than we have ever been able to. So I think there's an element of our culture returning to that oracular disposition, and that is also probably weirdly driving conspiracy theories as well.
Well, I think... Go on. No, please, Mitch.
No, I just wanted to say a word on behalf of the great parapsychologist Ian Stevenson, who studied reincarnation. And, apropos of what you were saying, Tony, rather than just saying, well, here's another fascinating story, he reviewed hundreds upon hundreds of cases internationally where he was able to correlate children's past life memories, dreams, retentions to actual physical details. And his work was just extraordinary. I mean, the man was an unprecedented genius, and I'm enchanted with that kind of work.
Again, he's one of these people, when you start digging deeper, it starts to get a little bit more flaky in terms of a lot of the cases, because an awful lot of the cases, that I think the vast majority of his cases, the Indian cases anyway, were always somebody of a lower caste claiming that their alter personality was of a higher caste. So, you know, there's the criticism, there's a vague criticism there. But having said that, you know, he was meticulous in the work he did.
Yep. Yep.
Now, my argument has always been with reincarnation is, what's the model? How does it work in practical terms? How can a consciousness that is either brain embedded, and if it's not brain embedded, it's brain processed in some way, can then transmigrate to another consciousness that is somewhere else, could be somewhere else in the world. It could, is there an immediate transference? And in the introduction to my new book, these are the points I make, that, you know, if we are going to have a rational model of survival after death, the thing we're going to have to be looking at is the term survival after death. Yes. And before death. These are, as you mentioned earlier on, these are time-based terms. Now, if there is, as Philip K. Dick said, a form of time that is at right angles to this time, that's where the answers lie. You know, you can still continue being alive in a functioning body for a long time, because your sense perception of what time possession, what time flow is, changes.
Yes.
And I think this is the major point that I make in my writings, you know, that yes, these things make sense to me. Reincarnation makes sense to me. I believe that what's taking place in reincarnation is that we are attuning into the holism, you know, what I call the uber daemon, you know, the collective unconscious of humanity. And under certain hypnotic conditions or under certain conditions, we attune into that greater field. But if we are all one consciousness experiencing the self subjectively, that explains reincarnation in one way, because we're all the same being.
Yes, yes. And it also lends insight to why the individual not only seems to enter life with a character, a temperament, fully shaped and fully formed. I don't think there's a parent who hasn't had that observation. I have two sons. They're both adolescents. The personalities that they have today are the personalities that I observed the instant they came out of the womb. It's absolutely uncanny. They came out of the womb with a character, a temperament. That character and temperament exists in them today at ages 15 and 18. It will exist in them when they're middle-aged. And we go through life, sometimes seeing therapists, sometimes talking to our friends, very frequently, with the same relational patterns over and over, the same basic issues, the same characterological issues. When our friends get tired of hearing us, you know, we tell the shrink about it and so on. And then when the shrink gets tired of hearing us, you know, we move on to something else. And again, I mean, this is just circumstantial, but using Occam's razor, reincarnation or eternal recurrence or whatever term you want to use, it's one of the oldest abided human beliefs in the world. Goes back to the very... Well,
as you probably know, I mean, what I do is I do the science of the eternal recurrence and the eternal return. And the idea, you know, that like your friend David Lynch, you know, and he plays with the eternal, you know, Mulholland Drive, various things here, it's a trope. And I do the science of this. And I say that, you know, when you're saying your sons, you know, they were always that personality. Well, they were, because they've been that personality many, many times. And they're just fitting into a new suit almost. You know, I'm back being a child again, but I'm actually an old man that's still me, that's been reborn as me. And there is my daemon that knows all this and remembers all this, my game player that is taking me through this life. And I think we're in very exciting stuff. And I have to say, Mitch, I have thoroughly enjoyed our discussion here.
Likewise.
It's been superb. It has been absolutely magical. And I've got so many ideas now. After reading your book, you know, I'm going to be plowing through all your books now. You know, I've got to read them all, because the things you're saying are absolutely, they resonate with me. And it's unusual. Well, it's not unusual. There are many writers, but I really resonate with what you're trying to do.
Thank you.
And I think it's like a Venn diagram. And Sarah and I have said this many times, that we need to get all of the people that have been on the shows here together, and just imagine the magic we could weave. We could create an egregore of the most extraordinary power.
Right. Yeah. I like that idea. And what's wonderful to me about these discussions is we in the West for better and worse, have been entrained into this kind of binary thinking, which can work okay within very limited schema and situations. But what you're pointing out in your work, for example, is that we are not bound by this thinking of nature versus nurture, for example, in the making of the human personality. There is, as always, a third choice, and it may be ineffable, it may be theoretical, it may be something that we have to work through, it may not always be intelligible, but it's there, and we sacrifice our intellectual birthright as human beings if we are endlessly married to this kind of binary scale of thinking. You're providing these third choices.
Let's stop being binary. I think that probably is the message here. Sir, any final points before we finish?
Well, I was just going to say, with regards to personality, I'm inclined to think there's some sort of cosmic blueprint as well, and that feeds into the astrological perspective of things. It's something that you know, you can go back into history and see these cultures, you see the same sort of religious myths occurring over and over again. And then when you get to the very, very beginning, it's all about the star gods.
Absolutely. Right. Okay. Well, we're coming towards the end of our hour and a half. So Mitch, I'm sure that there's going to be an awful lot of my readers, they're going to be absolutely fascinated by you and what you are trying to do as well. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people wanting to know more about your work. I mean, you're much more famous than I am, so therefore, you know, if they're drawn to your work as well, that would be fantastic. So let's so how can they contact you? How can they pick up on your material?
Oh, well, I appreciate it. Thank you. Daydream Believer is available anywhere you buy your books. It's in hardcover, paperback, digital. The audio will drop any day now. I've done the narration. I have a new book coming out in October called Uncertain Places, which is a collection of essays which deals very directly with some of the themes that we're talking about. I'm on Twitter at Mitch Horowitz, on Instagram at Mitch Horowitz 23. Website is my name, mitchhorowitz.com. And I'm just thrilled to have this conversation. I really feel like this was almost like an experience of coming home, and I'm delighted we could air these issues.
Oh, that's so wonderful to hear. Thanks very much, Mitch, and everybody else. Thanks for listening in on YouTube. I've been monitoring on YouTube, and there's a fair amount of interest over there, which is really wonderful. And this will be then placed on YouTube permanently for permanent watch. Right, I'm going to be trying to switch off now, and I hope I get it right because it was the first time I've done it on this newfangled machine. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you again all soon.